They did not send a fleet. They sent a file. 341 years of continuous observation, compressed into a single data packet and transmitted to Earth's deep space relay with a note attached. Closed, non-actionable, filed for archival purposes only. No warning, no demand, just a species closing a folder on humanity and moving on to something more interesting. The packet had a name. The observers called it the Catalogue of Terran Behavioral Inconsistency. Humans called it, once they understood what it was, the single most insulting document ever transmitted between star systems. Every entry contradicted the one before it. Humans build cathedrals and burn libraries. Humans cure disease and manufacture famine. Humans write laws against cruelty and then vote for it. The observers had watched for 3 centuries, waiting for the species to resolve into something coherent, something they could finally classify, and when it never happened, they gave up. Not out of fear, out of boredom. The file's closing line, translated, read, "Subject species lacks sufficient internal consistency to model. Reclassify as noise. Discontinue observation." Administrator Velora delivered the transmission personally, over a secure channel to the UN liaison office, smiling the way a teacher smiles when handing back a failed exam they no longer intend to grade. "We do not say this to wound you," Velora said, in English so precise it had no accent to place. "We say it because continued study is not warranted. You are not dangerous, you are not promising, you are simply unresolved. In another few centuries, perhaps, you will contradict yourselves into something legible." The room went quiet. Someone asked carefully what happened to species the observers did classify. Velora's smile didn't change. They become useful, predictable, governable in their own small ways. The distinction was not subtle. Being filed as noise was, in its way, the worst thing an advanced civilization had ever said about humanity, not a threat but a shrug. There was a second document attached to the transmission, smaller, almost an afterthought. A formal notice that Terran diplomatic status would be downgraded from observed to archived, effective immediately. No embassy closed. No treaty voided. Just a quiet change of category, the administrative equivalent of moving a folder from the desktop to a drive nobody checks anymore. Then one woman was not afraid. Dr. Mira Okafor had spent 11 years building a career nobody respected. Behavioral paradox analysis, the study of why people do the opposite of what their stated values predict. She had been laughed out of 2 conferences for arguing that inconsistency itself was information, not noise. She read the observer's closing line 3 times, then looked up at the liaison officer with an expression that had nothing to do with insult. "I want the raw file," she said, "not the summary, the raw file." "Dr. Okafor, they've dismissed us." "They didn't dismiss us." She was already packing her tablet. "They handed us 300 years of their own sensor data and told us it was garbage. Nobody hands over 300 years of anything by accident. People delete things they're ashamed of. They don't mail them." The raw file was enormous, 9 petabytes of observation logs, and Okafor was the only person on Earth who read paradox for a living. She assembled a team of 3, each mocked in their own field for the same reason she had been. They saw pattern where their colleagues saw failure. Dr. Sanjay Bhatt had spent a decade arguing that cryptographic noise floors were never truly random, a claim his department chair once called thermodynamically illiterate. Elena Rurik, an astrophysicist specializing in sensor array architecture, had been quietly removed from a NASA panel for insisting that a malfunctioning deep space telescope was actually recording something real. Both had been right. Neither had been believed until now. They opened the file in a borrowed lab beneath a decommissioned observatory because Okafor said the work needed to happen somewhere the observers weren't already watching. The lab still had chalk dust on the shelves from whatever it had been before it was a storage room. Nobody bothered to clean it. The first 2 days produced nothing. The file was enormous and unindexed, 3 centuries of raw sensor telemetry with no annotation, no key, no explanation of the observer's own internal categories. Bat built 4 different parsers before one of them ran without crashing. Okafor did not sleep in any conventional sense during that stretch. She cataloged paradoxes on a whiteboard that filled up twice, photographed, erased, filled again, because the lab had exactly 1 whiteboard and 3 people who needed it. The first real discovery belonged to Bat. 3 days in, he stopped typing and sat very still, staring at a column of numbers that shouldn't have meant anything. "These contradictions aren't random," he said. "They're timestamped to the second and they cluster. Every time a human does something the observers logged as inconsistent, there's a corresponding gap in their sensor coverage. Not a small one. A total blackout 30 to 90 seconds, centered on the observed subject." Okafor did not react the way a normal person would react to good news. She went very quiet. "Say that again." Every contradiction in their file happens exactly where their sensors go blind. She made him run it twice more on 2 different data slices before she let herself believe it. The pattern held both times. Bat printed the correlation graph on paper, an old habit from a supervisor who told him screens made people trust numbers too easily. He taped it to the wall. Nobody took it down for the rest of the project. They spent the better part of a day arguing about what the blackout could mean before Rurik would commit to anything. Bat's first theory was deliberate redaction, the observers erasing anything too damaging to their own narrative. Okafor didn't buy it. Deliberate redaction left seams. This didn't. The gaps weren't edited out of the footage. They were never recorded in the first place, which meant the failure lived somewhere upstream in the watching itself, not in what happened to the recording afterward. The second discovery belonged to Rurik, 4 days later, in what she kept calling the drive section of the analysis. A data file didn't have a drive section, but Rurik thought about the observer's surveillance grid the way an engineer thinks about a ship, and nobody corrected her. She traced the blackout pattern across 3 centuries of coverage and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the room's poor lighting. It's not a sensor limitation, she said. It's architectural. Their observation network runs on predictive modeling. They don't watch continuously, they watch the parts of a behavior their model expects, and they fill the rest in with prediction. When a human does something that breaks the model, the prediction engine can't extrapolate, so it drops the feed entirely rather than guess wrong. They stopped watching, Okafor said slowly, every single time we did something they couldn't predict. They stopped watching every single time we did something human. Rurik pulled up a visualization, 3 centuries of coverage rendered as a single scrolling map. Dense green everywhere except for thousands of small black gaps scattered across it like static. Each gap, she explained, sat exactly on top of a moment the catalog had logged as a contradiction. A soldier who refused a lawful order. A CEO who gave away a fortune. A rescue attempted against every rational calculation of survival odds. Every one of them a hole in the record, not because the sensors failed, but because the model looking through them had nothing to predict with. 300 years of footage, Rurik said, and the most important parts of it were never recorded because the machine watching us couldn't imagine what it was about to see. Okafor asked the question that mattered most. Was the blackout absolute, or did the sensors keep some residual data even when the predictive model gave up? Rurik spent a full night finding the answer. There was residue, fragments, corrupted and low resolution, like a photograph taken by someone who'd stopped trusting their own hands. The observers hadn't lost the moments. They'd simply refused to look at them clearly, and something in their own architecture had recorded that refusal as if it were a decision worth keeping. The third discovery was Okafor's, and it took her 2 more days to say it out loud, because once she understood it, she needed to be certain before she let herself believe it. She had mapped every blackout window against the observer's full surveillance grid, not just the coverage of Earth, but the coverage of everything, 41 systems, spanning the entire catalogued reach of observer territory. Their blind spots aren't unique to us, she said. Every species they've ever catalogued that behaved unpredictably created the same kind of blackout. This isn't a flaw in how they watch humans. It's a flaw in how they watch anything alive. Their entire surveillance architecture goes blind the moment a subject stops being predictable. They built a civilization-spanning intelligence network on the assumption that behavior can be modeled, and they never once accounted for what happens when it can't. Bat sat down on the floor of the lab not because his legs gave out, but because standing felt like the wrong posture for the size of what they'd found. We're not an anomaly in their catalog, Okafor said. We're a description of a hole in their entire network, and they mailed it to us thinking they were closing a folder. They handed us the blueprint for their own blind spot and called it garbage. Nobody spoke for a while after that. Rurik eventually broke the silence by asking the practical question, how many species out of the 41 systems had ever found this? Okafor's answer was the quietest thing she said all week. None. Every other species the observers had catalogued had either never noticed the blackout, or had noticed it and assumed it was proof of their own insignificance. Evidence the observers weren't watching closely enough to matter, rather than evidence the observers physically could not watch at all. 17 days after the file arrived, the observer conquered notice someone was reading it properly. The communication that followed was not the polished dismissal Velora had delivered in person. It came through diplomatic channels, drafted in the particular cadence of a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of formal menace. Unauthorized analysis of archival material constitutes a breach of observational protocol. You will cease all engagement with the catalog within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in reclassification of Terran space as an active security concern with associated countermeasures. translated by 3 separate linguists, all of whom arrived independently at the same plain reading. The observers had realized what humanity had found, and they intended to erase the evidence and everyone attached to it. Okafor read the ultimatum once and did not look afraid. She looked like someone recalculating a schedule. 72 hours, she said. That's not a threat, that's a confession. If the blackout architecture were a minor flaw, they'd ignore us. They're threatening reclassification, because we found something they can't fix in 72 hours either. She turned to Rurik. How fast can you map their fleet sensor doctrine against what we already know? Give me 40. It took 36. 3 observer vessels entered high orbit at the 72nd hour, precisely on schedule, because the observers were not a species that understood the tactical value of arriving early. Their formal communication had specified compliance, not silence, and their fleet doctrine reflected 3 centuries of watching a species they had never expected to fight back. The battle lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Rurik's team had spent 36 hours building something crude and specific. A broadcast pattern, drawn directly from the Catalogue's own blackout data, engineered to make Earth's defense fleet behave in exactly the unpredictable, non-model conforming way that had blinded observer sensors for 300 years. Not stealth, not jamming. Unpredictability manufactured on purpose aimed at a surveillance architecture that had never been designed to survive it. The observer flagship's targeting systems locked onto 4 Earth vessels in the first 90 seconds. A clean, competent opening, better than Okafor had expected, and for a moment it looked like the fleet's confidence in its own doctrine was justified. Then Earth ships began moving in patterns that matched nothing in 3 centuries of predictive data, and the targeting locks dissolved one by one, not from damage, but from the same blind prediction failure buried in every contradiction the observers had ever logged about humanity. 2 observer vessels retreated at the 4-minute mark, sensors flooded past any usable threshold. Earth let them go. There was no tactical reason to pursue ships that could no longer see. The third held position 20 seconds longer than the others, its captain apparently unwilling to accept that the species he'd been ordered to reclassify as noise had just turned 300 years of dismissal into a weapon. Then it retreated too, 6 minutes and 40 seconds. No observer casualties, no human casualties. A fleet designed around the assumption of perfect predictive modeling, defeated by the thing that model had never been able to hold. The personal transmission arrived 4 hours later on a private channel, not the diplomatic one. Velora did not smile this time. There was a long pause before any words came, longer than diplomatic protocol required, long enough that Okafor almost thought the connection had failed. We catalogued your species for 341 years, Velora said finally. We assumed the inconsistency was a limitation. We did not consider that we were the limited ones. Another pause. It was audacious, using our own blind spots against us. We did not think a species capable of building cathedrals and burning libraries in the same century was capable of anything so precise. You catalogued the wrong thing, Okafor said. You were never watching us. You were watching the parts of us your model could predict and calling the rest in error. What do you want done with this information? Nothing dramatic. We're not interested in exposing your surveillance network to every species you've ever watched. That's not leverage, it's just cruelty, and it doesn't get us anything useful. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as Velora had. What we want is access. Full archive, every system, 300 years of data on how your model fails and why. You built the only existing record of what makes a species too alive to predict. We'd like to study it properly, this time from the side that's actually unpredictable. There was no response for almost a minute. Agreed, Velora said, on the condition that our error remains between our 2 governments. Agreed. The channel closed. Okafor did not celebrate. She was already pulling up the first data packet Velora had sent as good faith, an index of every species the observers had ever quietly filed as noise, and cross-referencing it against a hypothesis she'd started building somewhere around minute 4 of the battle. That found her there an hour later, still working, the fleet's retreat already old news on every channel in the world. You're not even going to watch the footage? He asked. I've been watching the footage for 300 years, Okafor said without looking up. I just didn't know it yet. She kept reading. Know it yet. She kept reading.